Salve, salve, galera! Muito bom dia, muito boa tarde, muito boa noite. Está começando mais um podcast, o podcast da ZQuest. Eu sou o Luiz Gustavo Medina e daqui a pouco nós teremos uma grande mudança. Vocês perceberão que falaremos em inglês. E não é porque estudamos em boas escolas ou porque viajamos o mundo, mas sim porque temos um convidado internacional. E não é ele, Alexandre Silvério, o príncipe do condado. Também não é ele, Walter Maciel, o maior torcedor do Vasco da Gama da história desse país. Estaremos aqui com Stefano Chow, CEO e Investment Management da Azimut in China. Talvez o homem que mais entenda de China nesse momento, nesse mundo, nesse universo, e vai nos contar tudo o que aconteceu na China desde então, que é a nossa grande curiosidade. Então agora nós vamos mudar para o inglês, nós vamos switch to English. Good morning, good night, Stefano. Nice to meet you. I want to introduce you like a man who knows the answers. We are looking for answers, and you are our guy. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, and bom dia, Teco.
Do you want to start, Walter or Silvério?
Well, Teco, hi, Alexandre, Stefano. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I think we have a great opportunity of sharing Stefano's views with our investors and friends. As we know, China is already several steps ahead of us, and I'm sure there's many things we can learn and create a very, very interesting episode of our podcast.
Excellent.
And of course, I would like to thank you, Stefano. We are part of the same group, a global group that has presence in more than 17 countries. And the inputs from Stefano and his team in Shanghai and all the Asian region is really important for our decisions here locally, and I'm pretty sure that our investors will enjoy the conversation, and we will understand a little bit more how we interact and how the inputs from Stefano's teams help us to improve the performance of our funds here in Brazil.
Excellent.
I think you can start tell us how things are in China. Tell us about the recovery of the normal life or the economy. What's going on in China now in beginning of May?
Excellent. So Teco, I must say, at least in the big cities in China, like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Tianjin, etc., life has pretty much returned to normal. If you look at traffic on the streets, the number of people in the malls, in the restaurants, the number of people back at work in the offices, I would say we're pretty much at 90% back to normal. And you feel like life is slowly returning to normal. And this is, as we are now in the middle of May, which is about 2.5 months since the end of the lockdown, which was in March. So I would say it's a pretty quick return to normalcy. I also give you some latest figures to give you an idea how people are really returning back to normal. 2 weekends ago was the Labor Day holiday here in China, which is a long weekend, a 5-day holiday. And 150 million people traveled to go on holiday. So 10% of the population went on holiday. Well, that is lower than the figure of last year, but it's still very encouraging to see that, you know, people feel comfortable again to start going out. But another thing to bear in mind, even though things are slowly going back to normal, you notice it still, there's still many controls everywhere. So to give you an idea, everywhere you go, everybody is wearing a mask. You have to wear a mask actually to enter most buildings. They do a temperature check everywhere you go, whether it's a residential building, a restaurant, or a commercial building. They have to check your temperature. And I'll show you something interesting. I know you might have heard right now, Apple and Google are working on a contact tracing project. Well, they've been doing that already for 2 months in China, and the system they're using in China is significantly more advanced than what Apple and Google are doing. So China's two tech giants, Alibaba and Tencent, they work together to create this app where every single minute you get a new QR code. I'll show you mine, if you can see it. So if this QR code is green, you have to show this QR code before entering a building. If it's green, you can go in. But how do they create this? They're using their big data algorithms, because in China, 70 to 80% of payments are digital, right? Cash is practically non-existent in China now. So through this and geolocation technologies, they can track everywhere you've been. So to give you an idea, if, for example, I used digital payments to take a taxi today, and someone who took the taxi before me was positive, then my QR code would go red. And then they'd probably come arrest me and take me to quarantine. But as long as it's green, it's fine. So again, still many controls in place, but it seems like life has pretty much returned to normal. I also want to share some figures with you in terms of what's been happening on the economic recovery front. If you just bear with me 1 second. Okay. So we like to look at the level of transportation to get an idea of how much the economy has returned to normal. So if you see on the graph on the right, and that's the number of cars which are traveling on the Guojia Gaosugonglu, the national highway system in China. So you see for the figures for 2020, this is as of 2 weeks ago, on average, there are about 38 million cars traveling per day on the highways, which is significantly higher than the numbers in 2019. So this tells us two things. One, people are already starting to move around again. And as I mentioned to you earlier, for the Labor Day holidays, 150 million people traveled. And two, it seems like people prefer moving by car rather than by train or airplane. In fact, if you look at the figures on the left, these are a little bit dated, only as of the first week of April. You see, pre-epidemic in China, about 2 million people, 2 million passengers flew every day in China. By beginning of April, that number was still stuck at 500,000 people a day. So that hasn't recovered yet. And that makes sense if you think about it. I imagine in Brazil, even when the epidemic is under control, I assume the last thing anybody will be doing or wanting to do is to fly, right? So that still is the area of transportation which is the least to catch up. But again, if we look at the figure on the right, people are moving again, whether for business, for work, for leisure. So that's definitely a good sign. Now let me show you other. This is just out of interest. I took this. It's Flight Radar. It's a website which tracks all the flights in the world. So I took this about a couple of weeks ago from their website. It was in the afternoon, so it was early morning time in the Americas. So obviously there's very few flights in the Americas at that time, but it's just shocking to see that, you know, China's slowly getting back into normal levels of movement of people, while the rest of the world, unfortunately, is still in lockdown. So the latest figures I have is pre-epidemic. Every day there are approximately 7,000 flights a day. Now we're back to about 4,000 flights a day. So even in terms of flying, it's slowly picking back up again. And if we start looking at the number of people moving within the cities, you also see a big uptick in activity. This is the number of passengers on the subway systems of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Wuhan. And although these figures are a little dated, you can see that after the lockdown ended at the beginning of March, again, a lot of people started to move back to work. If you take this data as a measurement of the number of people moving back to work. And in fact, the latest figures I have from this week is on the Shanghai metro system, at least, on a daily basis, there are about 10 million passengers a day. So we're again about 90% back to normal in terms of movements within cities. Also, another area related to transportation we like to look at is the movement of goods, which is a good indicator of economic activity and industrial activity. So if you see in these graphs, we show the number of crude tankers, petroleum tankers, which are stopping at the ports in China. And you can see, again, levels here have pretty much returned back to levels in January. So oil consumption, if we use this as a proxy for oil consumption is back to January levels, which shows that the Chinese industrial machine is slowly gearing back up to normal. And if you see the graph in the middle, this is the number of bulk carriers. So these are the ones which move the dry goods, iron ore, copper, soybeans, so on and so forth. Again, there was a drastic drop since the epidemic started, but it's already recovered quickly back to normal levels. And in fact, the latest figures, this is probably most interesting to you folks in Brazil. The latest figures I had from as of end of April, the number of weekly shipments of iron ore coming from Australia and Brazil into China was back to January levels. So, this is data from the China Steel Trade Association. So this is definitely good news for many of those countries which export key commodities into the Chinese market.
Stefano, you have just mentioned that you are seeing some stabilization in the imports, both from Australia, but also Brazil. For us here locally, it's really important to have this kind of feedback and input from you. As you know, one of the most important companies in our stock market is Vale, and Vale is one of our topics on our portfolios here on the equity funds from AZ Quest. Regarding this specific point, what we would like to know from you is that with all this crisis at this moment, and of course, we are already seeing some recovery and strong recovery, as you have already said, in the industrial side, but also in the other areas of the Chinese economy. What do you think about the topics related to trading? Before the crisis, there was a big discussion between all the trade war, the increase in tariffs, and Trump and Xi was arguing each other about this. And of course, this impacts Brazil because we are big exporters of soft commodities, iron ore for China. How do you see this evolving in the coming months, in the coming years? Do you see any perspective of improvement in the relationship between Brazil and China regarding trading, imports, exports? How do you see this situation?
Okay, so if I had to make a projection for the rest of the year, I think the trade war will continue to, the trade war truce will continue to maintain until the elections. So as you all know, China signed a phase 1 trade agreement with the US in January. And China committed to buy about $200 billion worth of US goods. So that's agricultural goods, airplanes, so on and so forth. Now, the view we have and the view we had already back in 2018 and 2019 is, let's remember, Trump got elected in 2016 on a big platform, obviously, but some key things were immigration, border wall, and trade war, okay? So we're going into the election in November where he has not built a wall, and okay, he has a mini trade agreement. He has a mini trade agreement with China, but that's his only real, and tax cuts. So he has only two real victories to show his voters: tax cuts and the trade war. So with the phase one trade agreement, he can go to his electorate during the election cycle and say, hey, look, I started a trade war with China. I won. They have to buy $200 billion of goods. If he wants to continue to raise tensions with China and break the agreement, well, what happens? He's going to get to November and Joe Biden is going to say, excuse me, President Trump, you fought 4 years of a trade war with China and you have zero to show us, nothing. Actually, US exports have dropped to China, right? So I think for him, politically, it's important to keep this phase one trade agreement, at least until November. After November, then my guess is probably he will restart the trade war. Very likely, in my opinion, if he wins, that is. But again, unfortunately, the Trump administration tends to be, how can I say politely, a little bit unpredictable. So who knows? It is possible also the trade agreement will fall apart before the election cycle even starts. And if that's the case, obviously Brazil will be the big winner. Because what we saw during the peak of the trade war in 2018 and 2019 was China put tariffs of about 20%, 30% on US soybeans. And of course, where did the Chinese importers of soybeans go then? They went to Brazil. So if you look at the trade data, the imports of soybeans from Brazil surged over the past couple of years because it was effectively diverted trade away from the US. So you're absolutely correct, Alexander. If the trade war reignites, at least specifically when it comes to soybeans, Brazil will be a big beneficiary. However, I think the truce will stand at least until November.
Stefano, following that line, I believe that even with the maintenance, with the possible maintenance, as you've just mentioned, of the trade agreement with the US, the escalation of geopolitical tensions is noticeable. Looking forward, how do you see that evolving, and do you see the risk of the world's, the Western companies' supply chains diverting production to other countries such as Japan and Mexico? How do you see that big picture? It's still early, but it's important for our long-term scenario.
Well, first of all, let me make that's an excellent question, Walter. But let me make an observation first. For the past 10 years, this migration has already been happening, right? Sometimes there's a perception from outside China that China is a very export-dependent economy. It's a low-cost producer. If you go to any Zara or H&M in Shanghai, you go into the store, if you look very closely at the tags behind, all these shirts, and I'm sure the same in Europe, in Brazil, in the US, you go look, the tags don't say anymore made in China. They say made in Bangladesh, made in Sri Lanka, made in Vietnam, et cetera, because the cost of labor in China already has gone up so much. China has the third highest cost of labor in Asia after Japan and South Korea, right? So it doesn't make sense anymore to do low-cost production in China. That has already slowly migrated away over the past decade. The trade war probably accelerated it a little bit, right? But in terms of the bigger supply chains, I don't think that migration will be very quick. For a very simple reason. China is not Vietnam or Thailand, right? Where you can just use it as a production base. China is actually a huge consumption base, right? I'll give you a very simple example of Apple. Apple produces most of its iPhones in China. But let's not forget, 1 in every 5, 20% of iPhones are sold to Chinese. So sure, you want to move back all the production to the US, but does that make sense? If at the end of the day, you sell more iPhones to Chinese than you do to Americans, right? So another great example is the auto industry. China last year produced about 27 million cars. Only 900,000 were exported. The rest were consumed domestically. So when more and more production gets used for exports, Volkswagen's factories in China, they're not going to move, right? Tesla just built a $3 billion factory 30 kilometers behind me here in Shanghai. Again, they're probably going to use it as a production base for export throughout Asia, but most of it will be consumed anyways in China. So that's why many of these supply chains probably will not move very quickly outside of China. Now, some of those supply chains which are related to maybe national security, especially in light of what happened with the epidemic. So pharmaceutical goods, pharmaceutical protection equipment, health, yes, that maybe will move. But other industrial production supply chains, the bulk of it will continue remaining in China, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of the end consumer is in China.
Is the largest consumption market in the world.
Well, no, the US is still the largest consumption market, but China will probably catch up very quickly.
Following that line, I have one more question, which is not everyone is absolutely aware, and you recently showed us a very interesting presentation about the incredibly large volume of online consumption in China, delivery, and in terms of technology, you're far ahead. Do you see these epidemics having any kind of impact in changing consumption habits? And do you have a past experience in China that can enlighten us in the sense of looking forward?
Well, absolutely. I think you're right, Walter. The epidemic will very likely accelerate the trend towards migration of retail sales from offline to online. It's very likely this will accelerate the process. As far as China is concerned, it's a very unique situation, because although it's an emerging market, it has the highest penetration of e-commerce in the world. Just in terms of the volume of e-commerce, I'll give you some 2019 figures. The amount of sales online in China was already 5 times the amount in the US. Okay, so it's very high. It's already around 30% of retail sales are online. So the epidemic probably helped increase that penetration even more, but it was already high to begin with. But my view is what's going to happen in many emerging countries, other emerging countries, is probably what happened in China 10 years ago, right? So it's actually the big boom in e-commerce didn't come from the big cities. It came from the medium-sized cities, right? Because as the middle class grows in the medium-sized cities in Brazil, in India, in Indonesia, right? They want access to all the goods that their richer cousins in the big cities have, right? But those stores aren't available in their medium-sized towns. So that was a process that sort of accelerated the trend of penetration of e-commerce in China. And I think that's why the adoption rate eventually of e-commerce in emerging countries could be higher than in developed countries, right? Because in the US, you have a Costco and a Walmart in every city, right?
Yeah.
In emerging markets, you don't have a Costco and a Walmart in every city. So people who want to aspire to buy certain goods which they cannot access to, they'll eventually move to buying them online. As long as the whole delivery network is efficient and the payment network is efficient.
Silverio, tell us about the e-commerce in Brazil. What's going on? What can see in the future in comparison with Stefano told us minutes ago, and could we go in the same direction that China did?
I think that I totally agree with what Stefano has mentioned, in the sense that probably we are 10 years China is 10 years ahead of us in the penetration in all the digital payments platform they already have. But clearly, what we've learned from them as well, and from Stefano's input over the last months, is that the previous experience during the other epidemics in China accelerated this trend. I really think, and talking with the companies here and our investors know that I'm a big enthusiast of Magazine Luiza, and I have already shared my ideas with Stefano as well about this company. I think that is one of the 2 or 3 companies that will prevail in the digital retail segment in Brazil over time. And I was talking with Danny yesterday, in fact, and clearly the last 5 weeks they accelerated the next 5-year cycle in the sense of what they are doing to address the challenge of this period. I think that Brazil is still very unpenetrated in terms of e-commerce. Only 5% of the retail sales in Brazil is made through digital channels. For example, in the US, this is closer to 25, a little bit above this. And I think that China is even in the same direction, much higher than Brazil. And clearly, the big winners in the retail segment of this crisis will be the companies that are prepared to work online, to prepare on work digitally. I really think that the retail will become all digital in a sense, because the physical stores will probably be also distribution centers for the companies. So the penetration of in a country, in a continental country like Brazil, like China, is still important, but clearly the physical stores will be part of the digital ecosystem, and they are already accelerating this, and I'm really optimistic about Magazine Luiza's perspective in this scenario. It's not by coincidence that the stock market in Brazil is falling. The Ibovespa is falling 32% until yesterday, and Magazine Luiza is up 16%. Even with half of the stores closed, even with a lower level of sales compared to last year, of course, they are selling much less, but they are preparing the company very strongly for the digital era. They're already doing this. They were capitalized. This is important to say, because to make these investments requires a lot of capital, a lot of money. They have this in their pockets at this moment. They raised more than 5 billion reais last November. So I think the experience that Stefano has brought us with all the digitalization of the entire system in China, and in fact, of course, in Brazil, there will be some differences, but clearly, I'm really optimistic. This is one of the main themes on our portfolios for the last, I would say, 3-4 years, and Magazine Luiza is clearly the top pick from our portfolio within this segment.
Stefano, tell us about an important thing for us in Brazil, that's China growth, the GDP. You didn't do stimulus in China. You didn't need, I think. What you can say about the GDP in China for 2020 and 2021?
I think our estimate for what GDP growth this year will be is probably, to be honest, worthless. If we look at the range of what people have predicted for even short-term economic data, even for next month retail sales, it's all over the place. Because right now there is so much uncertainty in terms of what's happening in the economic recovery. I can only tell you with some certainty how things are looking in May and in June. And what we can see in May and June is the Chinese consumer has definitely started to take a big share and go out there and helping the economy recover. I'll give you just some simple data points. In terms of auto sales, April obviously saw a huge jump, about 60–70% growth in auto sales compared to February and March, unsurprisingly enough, because all the dealerships were closed in February. Most dealerships were closed. But it's interesting, if you compare it to figures to last year, we're starting to see growth in terms of auto sales. So this is very important because obviously buying a car is a big ticket item, right? So that shows there is consumer confidence. So at least in the short term, with short-term visibility, we can see the economy is quickly recovering. Now, whether that will carry over into third quarter, fourth quarter is still, in my opinion, a big question mark. Another big question mark is, will there be a second wave of infections? Right? Should that happen, then all projections are up in the air. But right now, in terms of whether the Chinese consumer or Chinese companies, we're seeing definitely a much stronger level of confidence. I'll give you also a very interesting number, and also very related to Brazilian exports. In March, it was the single highest record in the history of, since the data was created, of excavator sales. The big machines that dig up the dirt in construction sites, very expensive, large machines. So March was the record in the history of sales. 60,000 of these excavators were sold. So many of these construction companies are obviously fairly bullish on their pipeline of future projects in order to go out there and make these investments. And it's also, in my opinion, positive also because it's their view that there will be a lot more construction projects, whether residential real estate or infrastructure projects. And more of that means more steel. More steel means more iron ore, which is obviously positive for Brazil. So again, sorry, Keiko, I can't answer fully your question because there's so much uncertainty to give you a figure.
Another question. We are in the worst moment in Brazil with the virus. What lessons could you tell us? Could you learn? We can learn with China that.
Well, I would say I noticed not just in China but in Asia in general, the approach taken sometimes different from what they did in Europe. Never mind what they're doing in the US, which had to be a little different. So in China, the biggest mistake they did at the beginning was, if you were infected, even if you were positive, they sent you home. Okay. Now the problem is, you go home, you're probably going to infect everyone you live with. Well, it's not probably 100%. You will infect everyone you live with, and then you'll probably infect your neighbors. So they realized that was a big mistake early on in Hubei province. So after the lockdown started for a few weeks, that's why I think cases grew exponentially. Then they realized that's the wrong way to do it. So what they did, which I think was very good, was everyone who's positive, they don't let you go home. You go to quarantine. They set up a special quarantine hospital, even for people who have very mild symptoms, just a cough. They still put you in quarantine in a government facility. So you can't go around and spread it anymore. And I think it was when that started to happen that you saw a drastic reduction in new cases. And to give you an idea, that's why in Wuhan, which was the epicenter of the epidemic, they built 14 hospitals. So 2 of these hospitals were for the severe cases, but the rest were mainly they weren't even really hospitals, they're just dormitories to house people who tested positive and who weren't severe. So I think that was very effective, and Korea is doing something similar. In Hong Kong, they're doing something similar. In Taiwan, they're doing something similar. And of course, early on in many Asian countries, everybody always wore a mask, which I think was a big difference, right? I mean, it's crazy to think that just now in the US, they're telling people to wear masks, right? 2 months after the epidemic started in the US. But I think that's why the level of containment in many Asian countries has been fairly well done.
And Stefano, just to bring us some personal experience as well, how did the crisis affect your life specifically, about your relationships? How do you deal with your family, with your colleagues within the office? I know that Shanghai was not the epicenter of the health crisis, but of course there was consequences. Maybe you could bring your personal experience, how to deal. We at this moment in May here in Brazil, I would say that we are very close to the peak of the disease, of the infection. So it's being really harmful for all of us. Maybe you could bring us some color, some hope, how to deal with this.
Okay. Actually, when I remember talking to our Italian colleagues around about March, when the lockdowns were starting in Italy, and back then I warned them, your biggest fear will not be the virus, should not be the virus. It should be boredom. That's your biggest fear. Because in effect, that is true. I mean, it's terrible that so many people have been hit by this virus, so many people have died. But again, let's put it in context. The mortality of this virus is very low, is very low. So, and in general, it tends to hit people which have, pre-existing conditions or are of an older age. So most people will not get the disease, but it's the lockdown provisions that cause the most, to a certain extent, psychological harm, if you will. And I think that was what we experienced, especially in February, at the beginning of February, when the lockdown provisions started in Shanghai. That was a very difficult moment to live in, which many of you in Brazil, unfortunately, are also living through right now. And I think what we can see all around the world, what's happening is, the positive thing is humans tend to be very resilient, right? We can be locked up at home, but at the end of the day, whether you saw it in Wuhan, in Milan, in Madrid, people singing from their balconies, people yearn for freedom at the end of the day. So it was very tough in the beginning for the first month, but after a while, you sort of, move into a rhythm. And the good thing for us is we continue to work from home, which is always a good distraction. Market volatility, unfortunately, is a distraction too. Unfortunately, it's the bad kind of distraction. But at least it keeps your mind away from the fact that you're locked up at home. You try to live through that. And, one positive thing about all of this is how we live through it is, thankfully, technology nowadays is so advanced that, you can keep in touch like we are now across 2 hemispheres. So, all I can say is, from a personal perspective, stay positive, keep positive, think about the good things. What I like to do when during the lockdown, my wife and I, we did a list of all the things we would do once the lockdown ended, right? Just a nice psychological exercise. I suggest you guys do too. And in terms of market performance, also, again, stay positive. What we saw in China was, after the lockdown provisions ended, there was a quick economic recovery. Economic recovery was not V-shaped, but asset price recovery was V-shaped. So again, this is a very important thing to consider. And again, I know I'm going a little off topic, Alexander, but I just want to make an observation in terms of how different markets have performed. If we look at how China has performed, as I said, asset prices have very much recovered. But again, China was the first to get hit and the first to get out. The US has recovered a lot of the sell-off, right? But to be honest, they've already exhausted all their bullets, if you will, from monetary policy to fiscal policy. It is actually emerging markets like Brazil, like India, right? Which in my opinion are still remaining more resilient than the US economy when it comes to potential to have an economic turnaround, one, and have the resources to stimulate the economy going forward. With the Fed already cutting rates to zero, what are they going to do when there's a second wave of infections? Or if the economy doesn't recover as they expect in third quarter, fourth quarter, they don't have much room to maneuver. So that's why I'm also positive longer term on China. Again, same here. There hasn't been much fiscal or monetary stimulus, which leaves the government a lot of room should things continue to deteriorate. So again, stay positive from a personal perspective and stay positive on the markets.
Walter, do you want a final question to Stefan or show your Flamengo shirt to him? Ask him what's his favorite team in world or in China, or Brazilian players in China in his team. It's your turn.
That's very interesting point. Although
Yes.
China is the largest population in the world, Flamengo has the largest crowd in the world. And that's a Brazilian phenomena. But all this crisis was able to stop Flamengo, and that was a black swan. This is something we didn't expect. No, I just would like to highlight, as Alexandre said in the beginning, that we are a multi-asset house, and we have within Quest from long only to long bias, long short, macro, fixed income, inflation, credit, arbitrage, but we also have this fantastic opportunity of interchanging ideas and learning from Azimuth's global structure, and especially the opportunity of learning from having local Chinese expertise is a fantastic edge to our business model. And this is something that Alexandre has mastered in the sense of creating a interchange of ideas within our global capabilities and bringing those ideas to our local investment process. So this is something that we would like to share with our partners and investors, that we have this kind of opportunity. And this is, again, a fantastic edge. Stefano, thank you for being available for us. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to have this talk with you. And again, I agree with you. It's all about fear and greed. And we are at the height of fear. And as this subsides, markets will perform well again. Thank you.
Excellent. You're welcome, Walter.
When you come to Brazil, we will make a great barbecue in a mansion of Walter in Ibiúna. Would be a 5 days of party for you.
Excellent.
In Ibiúna, okay?
I will be waiting for that invitation.
And we'll go to Rio as well to watch Flamengo play live at Maracanã.
Excellent, excellent, excellent.
Thank you,
Stefano. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you all.